In the sleepy coastal town of Eagles Point, the Collins family was about to upend a ruthless gang's grip on power. When the notorious Steel Vipers set their sights on Hannah Collins, thinking she was just a fisherman's daughter, they had no idea her quiet, unassuming father was a highly decorated Navy SEAL veteran, with years of secret missions etched into his steady hands. Dawn broke over the harbor, gilding the nets and the worn pilings in a peaceful glow, as Hannah finished prepping their small fishing boat. For generations, the Collins name had been synonymous with hard work and honest living. But beneath the briny calm, tension was brewing in Eagles Point. Strangers on roaring motorcycles had swept in, bringing intimidation and vandalism wherever they went. That was before they met Samuel Collins. A man of few words, he'd left his SEAL days behind to raise his daughter on these gentle tides. Yet he still carried within him the discipline and skill of an elite warrior. And as the Steel Vipers cornered Hannah on the docks, they triggered a chain of events that would reveal one of the town's best-kept secrets and ignite a confrontation that would rock the harbor to its core. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. The sun rose gently over Eagles Point Harbor, painting the sky with ribbons of gold and pink. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their calls mingling with the soft slosh of the tide against wooden pilings. Small fishing boats bobbed in the calm water, tethered to the weather dock that had long served the local fishermen. In one of those rickety vessels, Hannah Collins, a slim but strong young woman with sun-kissed hair, lowered a net into the water. She could feel the rhythmic surge of the current pulling at the mesh. For most of her life, Hannah had lived by the rules of this harbor. Her father, Samuel Collins, a quiet, reflective man with deep-set gray eyes, owned a modest fishing business here. She had grown up assisting him on early morning trips out into the bay. Casting lines, hauling nets, cleaning fish. It was the simple, rugged routine of a fisherman's daughter. She secretly loved the sense of purpose it gave her, even if she teased her father about modernizing his methods. She'd learned from him how to respect the sea and treat nature's bounty without greed. To Hannah, these were the greatest lessons any parent could teach. That morning had begun as any other. Samuel had gone to the local bait shop to pick up fresh supplies, leaving Hannah to prep the boat. She wore cut-off jeans and a worn navy flannel shirt over a tank top, tying her hair in a messy bun. Her reflection in the water showed her wide hazel eyes and the faintest line of freckles across her nose. She dabbed a smudge of fish guts on her cheek with the back of her hand, wishing for once she could start her day without smelling like the ocean. But even that she couldn't resent too much. The harbor, after all, was home. From behind the boat's console, she surveyed the dock. An elderly fisherman was loading crates of lobster onto a truck. Another was coiling ropes and humming an old sea shanty. A breeze carried the tang of salt and seaweed. It was peaceful, Hannah thought. Peaceful and safe. She felt a soft pang of worry that her father was taking longer than usual to return, but shrugged it off. Sometimes he stopped to chat with old friends at the bait shop. Samuel was as reserved as they came, but in a small coastal town like Eagles Point, every errand could turn into a social call. While Hannah focused on the net, she became aware of a new sound creeping over the soft murmur of the waves, a distant rumble. She stood up straight, shading her eyes with one hand. The rumble grew louder, throbbing in the otherwise quiet morning. It was the heavy roar of motorcycle engines, multiple of them, coming down the main road toward the docks. The fishermen paused their tasks. Seagulls, startled by the noise, took flight en masse. In the next few moments, Hannah watched as a pack of motorcycles emerged over the small ridge leading to the waterfront. She counted 10 riders, each wearing black leather jackets with a striking emblem, a coiled steel serpent. The front rider was a tall man on a massive bike with ape-hanger handlebars, his stance commanding instant attention. It was clear from a single look that these were no casual riders just passing through. The group moved in formation, engines snarling, as though they owned the road. People began to step aside, uncertain and wary. The group parked haphazardly near the dock, and the tall leader dismounted, followed by his crew. Hannah studied them, trying to mask her unease. They exuded menace, but more than that, they seemed purposeful, like they'd come here on a mission rather than a leisurely ride. The tall man, dark-haired with a patchy beard, scanned the dock until his gaze fell on Hannah. He gave her a once-over, his lips curling into a predatory smirk. A fresh wave of tension gripped her. She felt cornered despite standing on an open platform near the sea. He approached, leather creaking, the rest of the gang fanning out behind him. Hannah could see the name embroidered on his jacket. Talon, a fitting name for someone who looked ready to tear anything apart. "Morning, sweetheart," he said. His voice was raspy, like someone who smoked too many cigarettes in too little time. "Nice boat you got there." Hannah swallowed. She forced herself to stay calm, though her heart hammered in her chest. Thanks. Not sure who you are, but you're blocking the dock. Fishermen need to unload here." One of the men in the group chuckled. Another spat tobacco juice on the ground. Talon gave a thin smile. "We're the Steel Vipers, in case you haven't heard. Me and my boys are just passing through, looking for a little relaxation." His eyes wandered around, taking stock of the area. "Thought we'd come down to the water, maybe sample what the local folks have to offer." The easy chatter of the morning died completely. An uneasy hush blanketed the dock, broken only by the shift of footsteps as the local fishermen realized who stood before them. The Steel Vipers had a reputation that stretched beyond the county. They were known for running guns, drugs, and intimidation rackets. Every rumor suggested they had connections to bigger players inland, and the local police were often too poorly funded or too scared to deal with them. That they had shown up at Eagles Point Harbor was an ominous sign, and Hannah sensed danger even before the man took another step. Hannah stood her ground, though she could hardly keep her voice from trembling. "We're just a small fishing community. Don't know what you expect to find here." Talon's grin widened. He looked at Hannah with a certain greed in his eyes. "What I'm looking for, pretty girl, is to have a good time. What's your name?" She hesitated, unsure if giving it would make things better or worse. But her mind raced for an excuse, lie anything. Before she could answer, the man reached out and brushed a lock of her hair, an invasion that made her stomach turn. Her instinct was to recoil, but she didn't want to provoke him. "Don't touch me," she said softly but firmly. He cocked his head. "Oh, feisty. I like that." The men behind him laughed under their breath. He jerked his chin toward the fishing boat. "What else you got on board?" "Just fishing nets. Supplies." Her throat was dry. "It's not for sale." He snorted and looked back at his men. "Guess we'll find something else to do to pass the time." Hannah's instinct screamed at her to run, to put distance between herself and these men. She scanned the dock for an ally. A few older fishermen were eyeing them warily, but no one looked eager to step in. The tension was too thick, the fear too real. Abruptly, she heard a familiar voice call her name, Hannah. Her father, Samuel, appeared at the top of the dock. He was carrying a bucket of fresh bait, which he set down when he saw the group of bikers. Talon's grin vanished momentarily as he glanced at the newcomer. "That your old man?" he asked, still addressing Hannah. She said nothing, but her eyes flicked in her father's direction. Samuel was tall, lean, and moved with an unassuming grace. He wore a faded baseball cap, a gray t-shirt, and cargo pants. Years of fishing had hardened his muscles, but no one looking at him would guess his past. They would see only an ordinary working stiff, well into his 50s, who spent his days on a boat. But Hannah knew better. She knew every line on his face, every quiet habit he had. She also knew that once, a long time ago, he'd been a United States Navy SEAL. Those were stories whispered in her childhood, never flaunted. He had served on missions he refused to discuss, returned home with scars both visible and hidden, and buried the combat side of himself in the routine of fishing. His extraordinary training remained a secret to nearly everyone in town. Samuel's expression was calm, but Hannah could read the concern in his eyes. He moved closer, stepping between Hannah and the bikers, his stance protective. "Everything okay here, honey?" he asked gently. Talon sized Samuel up, contempt flashing in his gaze. "Your daughter's sweet enough to look at," he said. "Might be we stick around, see what else is here for us." Samuel's jaw tightened. He looked at Hannah, then back at Talon. "We don't want any trouble," he said. "Neither do we," Talon replied, though his smirk suggested otherwise. "But trouble has a way of finding us. Don't it, boys?" The rest of the steel vipers chuckled and shifted, a pack of wolves around a cornered prey. Hannah saw a ripple of tension run through her father's shoulders. She watched as his right hand twitched. He was used to carrying firearms in a world long past. But there was nothing in his grip now except a father's love and a father's protection. In that charged moment, a single question loomed. How far would these bikers push? Hannah sensed that behind her father's measured composure lay a storm waiting to be unleashed. But not here, not yet. A flicker of doubt crossed Talon's face, as though he sensed something deeper about Samuel. He paused before gesturing for his men to follow him. "We'll be around," he said, stepping back toward his motorcycle. "This harbor better show us the hospitality we deserve, or else you'll all be sorry." Hannah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The group revved their bikes and roared off, leaving a cloud of exhaust in their wake. As soon as they disappeared, the fishermen on the dock began to talk in hushed, worried tones. Samuel touched Hannah's shoulder lightly. "You okay?" She nodded, though tears pricked at her eyes. "They just came out of nowhere." He nodded, scanning the road the bikers had taken. "I need to make a call." "To the police?" she asked. Samuel's face was grim. "Yes," he answered, though by the set of his jaw, Hannah suspected he didn't have much faith in local law enforcement. In this part of the county, help often came late, or not at all. But what else could they do? Hannah felt a chill run through her despite the warm morning air. She looked at the place where Talon had stood, remembering his cruel smile. Something told her that this was only the beginning of a far darker ordeal. And with the steel viper's engines fading into the distance, the question lingered. What happens when they come back? After the confrontation at the docks, Hannah and her father rode together in his old pickup truck, heading toward the local sheriff's station. The mood was unnervingly quiet. Hannah stared out the window, watching the tranquil coastal scenery slip by, the rolling dunes, the tall sea grasses swaying in the wind, the occasional fishing shack. She glanced at her father's profile. His stern expression was unlike his usual gentle calm. Something deep inside him had been stirred. She cleared her throat, wanting to break the silence but unsure of what to say. Finally, she managed. "They didn't hurt me, Dad. I'm okay." She was trying to reassure him as much as herself. Samuel nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "I know." His voice was even but laced with tension. "Still, they had no right to intimidate you." A memory flashed in Hannah's mind. She was 10, standing in the doorway of their small house as Samuel quietly told her mother about a bad dream. It was a dream about a mission that had gone wrong, something he'd never really explained. She remembered the trembling in his hands then. Over the years, he found solace in the steady rhythm of fishing, as though the sea's calm could soothe his war-torn memories. She wondered now how close he was to that side of himself she barely knew, the soldier, the warrior. When they arrived at the sheriff's station, a squat building with peeling paint and a single patrol car out front, Hannah immediately felt a stab of doubt. Sheriff Mills was a decent man in his late 40s, somewhat portly, wearing the weary look of someone chronically underfunded and understaffed. He greeted them in the lobby, his brow furrowed with concern. "They call themselves the Steel Vipers," Samuel said after a brief introduction. "A large group, maybe 10 or more. They showed up at the harbor this morning, harassed my daughter." Sheriff Mills frowned. "I've heard of them. They operate mostly in the next state over. Smuggling, drug running, who knows what else." not sure why they'd come here. He paused, swirling his coffee in a styrofoam cup. You said they threatened you, Hannah? Hannah swallowed hard. They didn't lay hands on me, but it was menacing. They made it clear they planned to stay a while. The sheriff sighed, massaging the bridge of his nose. I can put out alerts, ask the deputy to do extra patrols around the docks. But we're stretched thin as it is. If they're not committing a clear crime, we can't just arrest them. Best I can do is keep an eye out. A flicker of frustration crossed Samuel's face. They won't stop at intimidation. They'll escalate, especially if they think nobody will stand in their way. Mills spread his hands helplessly. We'll do our best, but you understand how it is. If you can gather statements from witnesses, if they do anything illegal, we can act. Until then, I advise caution. Don't engage them. Let us know if anything else happens. Samuel nodded curtly. Hannah could tell he was far from satisfied. She placed a hand on her father's arm, silently urging him to keep his cool. After a few more questions, they left. Outside, the breeze was picking up, carrying the salty tang from the water. Look, Hannah said as they headed back to the truck. We did what we could. Maybe they'll move on. Samuel eyed her. He recognized the hope in her voice, but he also recognized the unlikelihood of that scenario. We'll see, he said, voice subdued. They have a reputation. They don't just move on unless they get what they came for. Hannah exhaled, feeling a knot twist in her stomach. Her father never frightened her, but there was a certain grave finality in his tone. They drove home, a small cottage near a rocky outcrop overlooking the harbor. The place had belonged to Hannah's grandparents. The clapboard siding was painted a soft blue, with white trim. Inside, seashells and maritime trinkets lined the shelves, remnants of an old coastal life. Hannah retreated to her room, needing a moment alone. But as she settled on her bed, she found herself remembering the fear that coursed through her when Talon touched her hair. She wondered if she should lock the windows tonight. Perhaps it was an overreaction, or perhaps not. Downstairs, Samuel rummaged in a hall closet. Beneath a pile of old jackets and boxes, he found what he was looking for, a locked metal case. He carried it carefully to the kitchen table and opened it with a small key. Inside lay a 9mm pistol and a worn K-bar combat knife. They were remnants of his past, polished but seldom used. He checked the pistol, ensured it was clean, and loaded a magazine. Something stirred within him, controlled readiness that he thought he'd left behind years ago. He didn't want to become that man again. The guilt of war and the nightmares that followed were enough to crush his spirit. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that everything he tried to bury would soon resurface. The father in him demanded protection for his daughter, and that might mean unleashing the seal who still lurked in his bones. That evening, the dock was eerily quiet, as though the entire town was holding its breath. Shops closed early, and the few restaurants that overlooked the pier had minimal foot traffic. Hannah took a short walk, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but each approaching sound made her flinch. She saw a few local youths, skateboard in hand, who gave her questioning looks. She must have appeared on edge. At dinner, she and Samuel spoke in subdued tones. She kept glancing out the window, expecting the roar of motorcycle engines at any moment. Yet the night passed without incident. But no one in Eagles Point slept easy. The word had spread, a notorious biker gang was in town. Would they strike first at the docks, or were they hatching bigger plans? Early the next morning, the phone rang just as the sun peeked over the horizon. Hannah was in the kitchen, starting coffee. She jumped at the shrill sound. Samuel answered with a clipped greeting. A fisherman's frantic voice came through. "Sam, it's Bill Henderson. They vandalized a bunch of boats last night. Graffiti, broken windows. Looks like they slashed tires, too. The steel vipers. They left their mark all over the docks." Hannah could see the muscles in her father's neck tense. "We'll be right there," he said, setting the phone down carefully. Less than 15 minutes later, they were at the harbor. A sick feeling churned in Hannah's stomach at the sight of the damage. Several fishing boats were spray-painted with a metallic snake logo. Dock posts were scrawled with crude messages, obey or pay. Shattered glass glittered across the wooden planks. Marine supplies had been thrown into the water, and someone had defecated in a crate left on the pier. It was a brazen display of disrespect meant to instill fear. Bill Henderson, a gruff man in his 60s, pointed to his battered boat. "Cost me half my month's profits to fix this," he lamented. "These punks don't care. They think they can do whatever they want." Hannah felt hot anger rising in her chest. She spotted the initials TV scrawled on a hatched door, presumably for Talon Vipers, some twisted signature. All of this so quickly after yesterday's confrontation. Samuel led Hannah to the battered remnants of their own fishing boat. It wasn't as badly damaged as others, but the seat cushions were torn, a window was shattered, and half their nets had been hacked up. The father and daughter shared a look. Hannah's eyes brimmed with tears of rage. They worked so hard for so little, and now it lay in ruins. She didn't realize how tightly her fists were clenched until her father gently touched her shoulder. "We'll get through this," he said, though there was a tremor in his voice. Sheriff Mills arrived soon after, his face ashen. He took statements and photographs, promising to investigate. But the tension among the fishermen was palpable. They wanted answers. More than that, they wanted protection. And everyone saw how understaffed the sheriff's office was. The only real question was whether any of the fishermen would dare confront the bikers themselves. Thus far, the answer seemed to be a resounding no. Hannah gazed over the defiled dock and tried to swallow her despair. She whispered to her father, "What do we do now?" Samuel's eyes hardened. "We wait for them to show themselves again." In that moment, Hannah saw a transformation. The quiet fisherman was giving way to the trained soldier within. She sensed something dreadful in that realization because she knew her father despised violence. But if that was the only language the Steel Vipers understood, perhaps it was time for Samuel Collins to speak to them in it. A sudden crash drew everyone's attention. About 100 yards away, a pickup truck with tinted windows barreled through the parking lot. A man wearing the Steel Vipers jacket leaned out of the passenger window and hurled a brick. It smashed into a row of crab traps, sending debris flying. Bill Henderson shouted, "Hey!" but the truck roared off before anyone could do a thing. Hannah's heart pounded. They really were terrorizing the town, seeing how far they could push before real resistance emerged. And with each brazen act, the people of Eagles Point seemed more paralyzed, more afraid. She looked at her father, who stood like a statue, watching the retreating vehicle. The words he spoke next were barely audible, but Hannah caught them. They have no idea who they're messing with. A chill ran through her. She hadn't heard him speak with such cold certainty in all her life. The father she knew was compassionate, stoic, and never boasted about his skills. But the father she was seeing now was something else entirely, a man who had walked through life-threatening missions, capable of stunning violence if pressed. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. Yet she couldn't deny the pulse of anticipation in her veins. If the Steel Vipers wanted to push Eagles Point around, they might soon discover that beneath the harbor's placid surface lay a dormant beast, one with Navy SEAL instincts and a father's protective fury. The question that gnawed at Hannah's mind, though, was how far her father would go. And when he did, what might be left of the gentle man who raised her? The quiet turmoil that settled over Eagles Point deepened into a collective dread. People locked their doors earlier, and rumors circulated that the Steel Vipers had set up a makeshift camp somewhere north of town in the deserted canneries. A few locals claimed they'd seen the bikers hauling crates out of trucks late at night, though no one knew exactly what was inside. Gun running, drugs, contraband, speculation ran rampant. Meanwhile, the fishermen labored each day to repair the damage. Hannah had never seen the dock community so subdued. The men who used to bicker over net sizes and brag about the day's catch now exchanged uneasy glances, as though waiting for an even bigger blow to fall. Samuel's response to the chaos was meticulous silence. It was as if his mind was a machine, cataloging every detail. He walked the docks, helped neighbors fix their boats, and asked quiet questions. Where had the bikers been seen? How many were there? Did they carry firearms openly? The local fishermen, relieved to have at least one person who seemed unafraid, shared what little they knew. Hannah watched from the sidelines, torn between admiration and fear. She sensed her father's mind turning over tactical possibilities, escape routes, vantage points, fallback positions. She knew he had the discipline and skill set to fight back, but at what cost? What if the confrontation escalated and innocent people got caught in the crossfire? Late one afternoon, after another round of repairs to their fishing boat, Hannah found Samuel in the garage, staring at a map of Eagles Point pinned to the wall. Various locations were circled: the canneries, the old sawmill, the disused roads that wound into the forest. She cleared her throat, stepping carefully into the musty space. "Dad." He turned, the worry etched in his features briefly transforming into something softer. "Hannah, eh?" He folded the map over, like he was trying to spare her the details of what he was planning. She decided to be direct. "I know you're thinking about taking matters into your own hands." Samuel exhaled, leaning against the workbench. "I'm just preparing. The sheriff can't do much, and these men are terrorizing everyone." Her pulse quickened. "But you're not in the Navy anymore. This isn't a sanctioned mission. What if something goes wrong?" He studied her, his expression conflicted. "I won't do anything rash, but I can't just stand by while these thugs hurt people." Hannah opened her mouth to respond when a rap on the garage door startled them. Standing, there was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a plaid shirt, Ben Atkins, a friend of Samuel's who ran a small charter boat business. He and Samuel exchanged nods. Hannah could sense that Ben knew more about Samuel's past than most in town did. "You, got a minute, Sam?" Ben asked, glancing at Hannah as though uncertain whether to talk in front of her. "It's okay," Samuel said. "Go ahead." Ben stepped in, lowering his voice. "A few of us have been talking. We can't rely on the sheriff alone. Some of the older fishermen want to pull money to hire security, but we're not sure who we can trust around here. And the Vipers might just buy them off anyway." Samuel listened intently. "I get it. Hiring mercenaries could make it worse, though. Bikers like these don't just leave because someone put up a fence. They want control, not just to pass through." Ben nodded, his jaw tight. "That's what worries us. If we cave into them, then Tyre Harbor becomes a staging ground for whatever they're running. We'll end up losing everything." Hannah felt a pang of apprehension. She didn't want her father entangled in a vigilante conflict, but she understood the sense of desperation. "Isn't there a bigger police force or federal agency that can help?" she asked. Ben sighed. "We tried calling the county. They say they'll send a detective out, but we've been down this road before. By the time real help arrives, these bikers will have done their worst." Samuel placed a hand on Ben's shoulder. "Let me think about a plan," he said quietly. "But no one does anything without talking to me first. We can't tip them off." Ben met his gaze. A silent understanding passed between them, and then Ben left, saying he'd be in touch. Hannah watched her father's face, searching for any sign of conflict or hesitation. Instead, she saw only determination, chiseled out of years of experience. He picked up the map again, pointing to a back road near the old cannery. "They're likely holed up around here," he murmured. "There's a small inlet and a couple of abandoned warehouses. Perfect for storing contraband. Lots of cover, minimal foot traffic." Her voice trembled slightly. "You can't be thinking of going there alone." "I'm not planning a direct confrontation," he assured. "I just want to scout it out. If we know what we're dealing with, we can find a way to stop them without leading to a massacre." His words set off alarm bells in Hannah's mind. She had visions of her father skulking through the shadows, eavesdropping on armed bikers, creeping close enough to glean their secrets. She had no doubt he could handle himself if it came to it, but these men played by their own savage rules. One misstep could be fatal. Later that night, while Hannah tried to distract herself with a novel, she heard the shuffle of boots near the front door. She hurried to see her father pulling on a dark jacket, the 9mm pistol holstered under his arm. Outside, the moon was a silver sliver, offering just enough light to navigate by. "Dad, please," she whispered, a lump forming in her throat. "Let someone else go. At least let me come with you." He set a gentle hand on her cheek. "No, I can't risk you. Stay here, lock the doors." He offered a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be careful." She felt a tidal wave of emotions, fear for his safety, pride in his courage, and a helplessness that made her want to scream. But she nodded, hugging him briefly before he stepped into the night. Hours crawled by like days. Hannah paced the living room, peering out the window at every sound. The clock on the mantel seemed to mock her impatience. Midnight came and went. 1 in the morning. 2. Her heart pounded with each minute. What if he hadn't made it back by sunrise? At around 3 o'clock, the door creaked open. Hannah rushed forward, flipping on a light. Samuel entered, hair damp from the coastal fog. He moved quietly, but Hannah noticed the slight hitch in his gait. "What happened?" she asked anxiously, scanning him for injuries. He grimaced and flexed his shoulder. "I'm all right. I slipped on some rubble and bruised my arm, but nothing serious." He locked the door, engaging both the chain and deadbolt. She let out a shaky breath. "Did you see them?" "Yes." He hung his jacket on a hook. "They're set up in that big cannery building near the water. At least 15 men, maybe more. I saw crates, looks like guns possibly. Couldn't get close enough to be sure." He rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaustion etched across his features. "They have a couple of sentries posted. I'm guessing they have connections with bigger networks. They're comfortable, like they own the place." Hannah's stomach dropped. "So they're not leaving anytime soon." Samuel nodded, his mouth set in a grim line. "They're fortifying, and they're definitely armed." A hush fell over the living room. The refrigerator's hum seemed disproportionately loud. Hannah realized how dire the situation had become. The steel vipers were turning her home into a stronghold, and no one seemed able to stop them, except perhaps a quiet fisherman with a lethal skill set. She reached out and gripped her father's hand. "What do we do now?" He inhaled sharply, as though mustering courage. "We find a way to isolate them, disrupt their supply lines, and push them out without letting them know I'm behind it. If they suspect one man is picking them off, they'll go after you too." "I won't risk that." Fear flickered in her eyes, but she nodded. This was a reality far beyond everyday life, more akin to the covert missions her father had once undertaken in distant war zones. Except now, the battlefield was the harbor, the cannery, and the small roads that Hannah had traveled since she was a child. Before they parted for the night, Hannah asked, "Do you think there's a chance they'll come after us directly?" Samuel glanced at the window. "Yes. If they figure out I'm not just a simple fisherman, they might use you as leverage." The implied warning echoed in her mind. Her father paused, meeting her gaze with unwavering sincerity. "I won't let that happen." Despite the reassurance, Hannah felt a hollow dread in her chest. She knew the vow was heartfelt, but she also knew that such promises sometimes broke under the weight of reality. She followed him to the hallway, where the metal case was kept. He locked the gun inside, though it was loaded and ready for quick access. And as she tried to sleep, her thoughts circled like restless vultures. Her father was about to wage a personal war against a gang of hardened criminals. She wished there were another way, a safe, peaceful resolution. But as she drifted into a fitful slumber, one fear overshadowed all others. The quiet man who had spent his life avoiding violence was on a path where violence seemed inevitable. Somewhere in the darkness of that night, a phone rang on Talon's end, wherever he was. Perhaps the gang leader was receiving word of a mysterious figure skulking around a cannery. Or maybe he was busy laying the groundwork for his next move, entirely unaware that a vengeful ex-SEAL was about to become his greatest nightmare. Hannah wouldn't learn which it was until fate slammed them all together again. A few days passed in tense anticipation. Samuel coordinated with a handful of trusted locals, Ben Atkins and two other men who had some experience with firearms. They met covertly in the back room of a boat shed under the cover of darkness, pooling their information and resources. Word trickled in about the bikers' movements. They ran small errands in town during daylight, always in pairs, never letting their guard down. At night, they retreated to the cannery, where lights glowed through broken windows, a beacon of their new domain. Hannah was never privy to the late-night strategy sessions, but she gleaned snippets whenever her father returned. His eyes showed the weight of planning something dangerous, something that might turn bloody. She tried to help by keeping watch around the harbor during the day, discreetly noting which motorcycles came and went. By comparing notes, she and Samuel discovered that at least 3 riders stayed behind at the cannery most mornings, presumably guarding their contraband. The rest patrolled the roads, occasionally causing havoc with theft and vandalism. One afternoon, while Hannah was at the local diner picking up lunch for her father and his small band of co-conspirators, she overheard a conversation between 2 tourists who had just walked in. They were complaining about a group of men on motorcycles who had forced them off the coastal highway, laughing as they revved their engines around the frightened visitors. The tourists vowed never to return to Eagles Point. Hannah's heart sank. The livelihood of the town, a trickle of summer tourism, was withering because of these men. She returned to the boat shed, passing along the news. Anger simmered in Ben's voice. "They're sucking the life out of this place," he growled. "We can't take much more." Samuel nodded, jaw set. He stood near a folding table with a map of the region, discussing possible choke points on the roads leading out of town. Though Hannah tried to stay quiet, her curiosity got the better of her. "So the plan is what? Ambush them on the road?" Ben exchanged a glance with Samuel. It was her father who answered. "Nothing so direct yet. We're looking at ways to disrupt their supply chain, maybe force them into a position where the law has to intervene. If we catch them with large shipments of weapons, for instance, that might draw state troopers or even federal agents." Hannah felt both relief and dread. She was thankful they weren't planning an all-out shootout, but she also knew messing with the biker supply line was perilous. One slip could bring about violent retaliation. Later that same day, Hannah was scrubbing down the deck of their repaired boat when she saw a familiar figure on the dock. Talon, the gang leader, accompanied by 2 of his men. Her pulse thundered. She immediately looked for an escape, but was too late. Talon noticed her and walked over with a lazy swagger. "Afternoon," he said, voice dripping with false cordiality. "Hannah, isn't it?" She wiped her hands on a rag, struggling to keep her composure. "That's right." He looked around, noting the newly patched sections of the boat. "Heard you had some trouble with vandalism. Must be tough on a family business." He made a show of looking sympathetic, but his eyes were cold. She bristled at his hypocrisy. The nerve of this man, who almost certainly orchestrated the vandalism himself, to feign concern. "We're managing." Talon laughed, his men echoing the sound. "Good to hear. I'd hate to see a sweet girl like you put out of business." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "In fact, if you ever need help, protection, let's say, my crew knows how to keep trouble away." The gall of his insinuation made her cheeks burn. "No thanks," she said flatly. He didn't move away. Instead, he reached out and ran a finger along a scratch on the boat's hull. "Damage like this can happen again. This is a rough town all of a sudden." His tone was casual, but the threat was obvious. Hannah's heart pounded. She wanted nothing more than to shove him off the dock, but she also knew that acting on impulse could cost her dearly. Still, she refused to show fear. "I can take care of myself." He looked her up and down, then let out a derisive chuckle. "I bet you think that's true." One of his men, a tall, lanky figure with a spider tattoo on his neck, snickered ominously. But maybe your old man needs a friendly reminder that we run things around here now. Cold dread clenched Hannah's stomach. So they were on to Samuel, or at least they suspected he might pose a problem. She tried to keep her voice steady. My father's not looking for a fight. Talon's dark eyes sparkled with amusement. We'll see. But if he wants to stir the pot, I'd hate for you to get caught in the boil. With that chilling remark, he jerked his head at his men, and they sauntered off, leaving Hannah trembling with pent-up fury and fear. That evening, she recounted every detail of the encounter to her father. Samuel's face was stony. They're testing us, he muttered. They suspect we might resist, so they're applying pressure. He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair. From now on, don't wander off alone if you can help it. And keep your phone on you at all times. Hannah nodded, crossing her arms against a sudden chill. She wondered how long they could maintain this fragile facade before something snapped. Every day, tension ratcheted higher, like a violin string stretched to near breaking. Just before midnight, a small group gathered again at the boat shed. This time, Hannah followed discreetly, not wanting to be left out in the cold. She hovered near the entrance, listening. Samuel's voice carried in the still air. We can't risk a firefight in town. Too many innocent people. We need to draw them out, away from the harbor, he said. Ben replied, agreed. But how do we do that? Samuel paused. We create a diversion, a rumor about a big cargo arriving at the old pier near Redwood Cove. The Steel Vipers will want to check it out, especially if they think it's valuable. We set up a vantage point, record them while they're armed to the teeth. Maybe that evidence is enough for the state to act. A third voice, belonging to a fisherman named Jorge, chimed in. That could work, but they might see through it. They're not stupid. Samuel's tone was resolute. It's worth a shot. Better than waiting here for them to pick us off. Hannah stepped forward, her footsteps echoing on the wooden planks. I want to help, she said, startling them. She met her father's eyes. Don't shut me out. Samuel looked torn. Hannah, this is no place for. Don't say it, she interrupted, her voice trembling. I know how to handle myself. We're all in danger anyway. At least let me do something productive. Ben and Jorge exchanged glances. Samuel let out a slow breath. Fine, he relented at last. But you follow my instructions to the letter, understand? She nodded, relief mixing with anxiety. Absolutely. The plan came together quickly. They would spread rumors through certain channels, an overheard conversation at the diner, a misleading phone call from a payphone in the next town, about a midnight drop of hot cargo at Redwood Cove in 2 nights' time. The hope was that Talon or one of his lieutenants would investigate, bringing enough men and arms to incriminate themselves. But the plan required Hannah's involvement. She would be the bait, discreetly letting slip to a known local gossip that she heard about some big job happening near Redwood Cove. The gossip would carry the story, eventually reaching the Steel Vipers. Hannah swallowed her nerves, replaying the lines she'd need to deliver. She understood that if the Steel Vipers caught onto the ruse, they might retaliate viciously. Yet the sense of purpose, collective determination in the room, buoyed her spirits. At least they weren't cowering anymore. The next morning, Hannah followed through. She visited the popular coffee shop near the harbor and deliberately let slip, within earshot of a curious waitress, that she'd overheard some fishermen talking about an unusual delivery. True to Eagles Point nature, the waitress feigned disinterest but kept prodding for details. Hannah gave cryptic hints about a big score rumored to arrive by boat under cover of night, possibly related to valuable electronics or something even more secretive. She left just enough gaps for the waitress to fill in with her imagination. By late afternoon, the rumor had taken on a life of its own. Word reached a local boat mechanic who was known to do shady repairs on the sly, and from there, it traveled further. That was how gossip worked in a small town. Before the day was out, Hannah overheard random people discussing the so-called mystery cargo at Redwood Cove, each with their own embellished version of events. Hannah's hands trembled as she realized the trap was set. Would the steel vipers bite? Would they show up armed, or would they send a scout? 2 nights later, they got their answer. Just after 11 p.m., under a moonless sky, Samuel, Ben, and Jorge stationed themselves with binoculars and a camera on a cliff overlooking Redwood Cove. Hannah stayed behind in her father's truck, watching the approach road through the rearview mirror, her stomach in knots. A hush blanketed the rocky shoreline. The waves crashed softly against the old pier, half rotten with disuse. Then, headlights cut through the darkness. Motorcycles and a van rumbled down the winding road, halting at the edge of the cove. Hannah's adrenaline spiked as she counted at least 8 bikes and maybe a half-dozen men. She recognized Talon among them, striding ahead with purposeful menace. Hannah radioed a whisper to her father, "They're here." From her vantage point, she saw faint outlines of the men near the pier, flashlights bobbing as they searched for this rumored cargo. A quiet glee mixed with terror in her heart. If they brandished weapons, Samuel and Ben would catch it on camera, potentially the evidence needed to bring higher authorities crashing down on the steel vipers. But as minutes ticked by, an uneasy feeling slithered up Hannah's spine. Why did they bring a van? She squinted through the dark, trying to see what was inside. Her blood ran cold as 2 men slid open the van's side door. Metallic clacks echoed in the still night. Rifles, possibly. They were preparing for something more than just a recon mission. A sharp rustle on the radio. Samuel's tense whisper, "They're heavily armed. We need to get out of here once we have enough footage." Hannah glanced nervously at the approach road. She saw another set of headlights cresting the hill. Another biker. No, the shape was different. It looked like a truck. Her heart hammered. Had the steel vipers reinforced with more men? What she saw next nearly knocked the breath out of her. The new arrival was the sheriff's vehicle, creeping up without lights. Sheriff Mills was stepping out alone, shining a flashlight. He was walking straight into the steel viper's ambush, completely unaware of the plan. Something had gone disastrously wrong. Hannah's heart lurched. This was supposed to be a covert operation, but now the sheriff was barging in, presumably on some tip of illegal activity. If the steel vipers saw him, it could ignite a shootout. And with so many armed bikers, Mills didn't stand a chance. She fumbled with her radio. "Sheriff's here. He's walking right into them." On the other end, she heard the crackle of static, then her father's urgent voice. "Get ready to drive out of here, Hannah." No. At that exact moment, 2 of the bikers swung their flashlights toward Mills, who raised his hands and shouted something. The still night air erupted into chaos. A barked order, a clatter of weapons, and the sheriff's flashlight spinning to the ground. Hannah stared in horror as the gang encircled Mills, guns drawn. The entire plan was unraveling in real time. Her father and the others were pinned on the cliff, forced to watch from a distance. If they intervened, it would be a firefight they couldn't possibly win. If they did nothing, the sheriff's life was in the biker's hands. She gripped the steering wheel, paralyzed by indecision. Then the radio crackled again, her father's voice taut with desperation. "Hannah, start the truck. Prepare to move." She glanced out the window, her heart pounding. The sheriff was outnumbered, at the mercy of Talon and his men. And she was the only one with a vehicle close enough to do something, anything to save his life. In that moment, she realized there was no easy answer. The next move could change everything, and quite possibly cost her her own life. Hannah's mind raced as she turned the key in the ignition. The truck's engine rumbled, a sound that seemed deafening in the tense hush of the coastal night. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. She peered through the windshield at the distant glow of flashlights dancing erratically near the old pier. Sheriff Mills's voice carried faintly through the salt-tinged air, though she couldn't decipher his words. The radio crackled with her father's urgent command, "Stay put. Don't reveal yourself." Her pulse pounded. Mills was alone, confronted by armed men who wouldn't hesitate to hurt him. She doubted the bikers would kill a lawman outright if they thought they could use him as leverage, but with criminals like the Steel Vipers, there was no guarantee. She had two choices: follow her father's advice and remain hidden, or try to create a diversion that might give the sheriff a chance to escape. Gritting her teeth, Hannah shifted into drive. Her father's voice echoed in her head, but the raw injustice unfolding by the pier propelled her forward. She pressed the accelerator, easing the truck onto the narrow gravel path leading down to the beach area. Atop the cliff, Samuel, Ben, and Jorge had no immediate way to stop her. They could only watch as the truck's headlights cut through the darkness. Hannah flicked them on high beam, hoping the sudden glare would confuse the bikers. Down by the pier, Talon and his men jerked their heads toward the incoming lights. Instantly, several of them raised rifles. The sheriff, on his knees, glanced over his shoulder, eyes wide. Hannah felt her stomach twist at the sight. Mills was absolutely vulnerable. She fought back panic. Her father had once taught her that in dire situations, a bold, unexpected move can confuse the enemy, shock and awe. The memory flashed. He'd been describing a technique from his SEAL days, not instructing her to go do it on her own. Yet here she was, about to attempt a half-baked version of it. A string of curses rang out as the truck barreled closer. Hannah gunned the engine, the vehicle bouncing on the rough terrain. She heard bullets whistle past, pinging off the metal frame. A side mirror shattered. Her breath caught in her throat. She swerved the truck in a wide arc, aiming to position it between the bikers and the sheriff. Tires skidded on loose gravel, flinging dust into the air. The sudden commotion forced some of the bikers to scatter or dive behind cover. Hannah slammed the brakes mere feet from the crouching Mills, who shielded his face from the debris. Her lungs burned with the adrenaline spike. The door flew open, and she shouted, "Sheriff, get in." Mills didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, launching himself into the passenger seat. The moment he was inside, Hannah floored the accelerator, spinning the truck around in a cloud of dust. The bikers opened fire, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness. One bullet thudded into the truck's tailgate, another punched through the rear window, sending glass shards flying past Hannah's head. She let out an involuntary shriek but kept driving. In the confusion, Talon's roar of rage was barely audible over the gunfire. He was shouting orders, but Hannah couldn't make them out. The headlights illuminated a figure on a motorcycle revving to pursue, but the dust cloud gave her a brief advantage. She careened around a cluster of boulders, the truck fishtailing dangerously close to the ledge where the cove dropped off. Mills clutched the dash, face pale. "You're insane," he blurted, though gratitude and shock mingled in his expression. "They'll be right behind us." Hannah's heart thundered so hard she feared it might leap from her chest. She wrestled with the steering wheel, guiding them onto the main road that wound away from Redwood Cove. The tires squealed in protest. The sheriff grabbed his radio. "Backup needed at Redwood Cove," he gasped, though they both knew any official backup was too far away to matter in these next critical minutes. Headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, motorcycles surging forward like ravenous beasts. Hannah tried to push the truck faster, but it groaned at the strain. It was built for hauling fishing gear, not outrunning a pack of furious outlaws. "Take the left fork," Mills instructed, pointing to a narrower road that led through a stand of dense pines. "We can lose them in the forest." Hannah complied, the adrenaline fueling her quick reflexes. The truck bounced over ruts and loose stones. The bikers struggled to maneuver their heavier machines on the rough terrain, but they didn't relent. Their engines roared, closing the gap whenever the truck slowed to navigate a tricky turn. Branches scraped the side of the vehicle. One sharp turn nearly sent them sliding into a ditch, but Hannah yanked the wheel, keeping them on track. A bullet shattered the rear windshield completely this time, sending shards raining over the truck bed. The night air whooshed inside, cold and stinging. Mills fumbled for his sidearm, but cursed when he realized he'd lost it during the scuffle at the pier. "We're sitting ducks," he spat, scanning the gloom for an exit strategy. Up ahead, a fallen tree blocked half the path. Hannah felt a wave of dread. If she slowed too much to navigate around it, the bikers would catch up in seconds. She braced herself and hit the gas, hoping the truck's momentum would carry them over the smaller branches. The front tires bounced violently, the vehicle lurching sideways. For a moment, it felt like they'd tip over, but miraculously, the truck landed back on all four wheels. The chase continued through the winding forest. Though the bikers were tough, the terrain gave Hannah a slim advantage. She caught glimpses of them struggling to maintain control on sharp bends, cursing and weaving to avoid collisions with trees. One motorcycle wiped out entirely, throwing its rider into a patch of undergrowth. But at least three more still hunted them. Through the swirling dust and branches, Hannah spied a break in the tree line, a chance to rejoin a main road that led toward Eagles Point. If they could reach the populated areas, maybe the bikers would back off. Or maybe they wouldn't. The Steel Vipers had already proven they had no qualms about public violence. She veered onto the asphalt, the tires screeching. The sudden smoothness disoriented her after the rough forest track. She prayed the truck had enough left in it to pick up speed. Her eyes flicked to the fuel gauge, half a tank. Enough to keep going if the engine held. Mills exhaled, glancing out the shattered back window. They're still coming. 3 sets of headlights bobbed on the horizon, engines howling as they neared the road. Hannah swallowed. Sweat trickled down her brow. Any ideas? The sheriff leaned forward, scanning the night. There's a turnoff toward the gravel pit. If we can get behind those mounds, we might lose them. She nodded, fighting a surge of terror. The entire situation felt surreal. Less than an hour ago, she was preparing for a covert camera op, and now she was in a life-or-death chase with a half-dozen outlaw bikers. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, telling her to stay hidden. She hoped he was safe, that he and the others managed to slip away from the cliff unnoticed. She took the next left, ignoring the posted sign warning, "No trespassing, quarry site." The truck rattled over a cattle guard, dust rising in a cloud behind them. The headlights illuminated towering gravel piles like ghostly sentinels in the darkness. She twisted the wheel sharply, weaving around the mounds, searching for a place to hide. The sheriff unlatched his seat belt, turning around to peer through the back. One of the bikers had closed in drastically. Hannah heard the distinct pop of gunfire, and a bullet lodged into the side panel, whining like a wounded animal. "Hard, right?" Mills shouted. Hannah obeyed, jerking the wheel so violently that the back tires fishtailed, nearly slamming them into a stack of railroad ties. She yanked the wheel again, the truck swinging into a partial 180. Dust engulfed them, stinging her eyes. She stomped the brake. The next seconds were a chaotic blur. The biker, unable to see through the dust, shot past them. He skidded, lost control, and toppled into the gravel with a metallic crunch. Another rider swerved wide, trying to avoid a collision, but ended up smashing into the first. Hannah cringed at the terrible sound of twisting metal. The last biker careened around the wreck, evidently deciding it wasn't worth continuing alone. He roared off into the darkness, presumably to regroup or seek help. For a moment, the only sound was the labored idle of the truck engine. Hannah realized she was shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Mills still gripped the dash with white knuckles, eyes wide. We did it," Hannah managed, adrenaline crashing into relief. She stared at the 2 bikers sprawled on the gravel. One was moving, trying to disentangle his leg from the twisted metal. The other lay ominously still. She felt a surge of nausea. Mills grabbed the radio. "Officer down at Redwood Cove. Perps in pursuit. 2 suspects down at the old gravel pit. Send medical assistance." His voice cracked, but he steadied himself. "You okay?" he asked her, looking her over. She nodded weakly. "Yeah." In the back of her mind, she wondered how this would play out. Would these wounded bikers be arrested and lead authorities to the rest of the Steel Vipers? Or would the gang simply launch a retaliatory attack bigger and worse than ever? She also worried about her father. Did he see the fiasco at Redwood Cove? Was he safe? Mills reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. Hannah, you saved my life. You know that. Her cheeks burned, partly from the dust, partly from embarrassment. She nodded, swallowing hard. I just couldn't leave you there. He nodded, a mixture of gratitude and concern etched in his features. I'll never forget it. But we need to be prepared for the fallout. They'll come for you, or your father, or both. We have to get you somewhere safe. As the distant wail of sirens finally approached, Hannah closed her eyes, heart still hammering. She had no illusions about what came next. The Steel Vipers had been publicly challenged. Talon wouldn't let that go unanswered. All she could hope was that her father's plan, whatever it was, still had a chance of stopping them before more blood was shed. But the fear in her chest told her that the worst was yet to come. While Hannah was caught in the high-speed chase, Samuel Collins and his companions found themselves pinned on the cliff above Redwood Cove. The bikers' attention was elsewhere at first, focused on the sheriff and the mysterious truck that had burst onto the scene. That gave Samuel and the others a chance to slip back into the tree line undetected. But as soon as they heard the gunfire and saw headlights storm off into the night, their hearts clenched. Samuel wanted to bolt down the slope to rescue Hannah, but that would have been suicidal. A group of armed men still loitered around the pier, cursing and shouting about the ambush. He couldn't risk leading them straight to Hannah if she was escaping by road. Crouched behind scrub oak, Ben whispered, "Do we follow them?" Samuel shook his head. "They're hunting. We need to keep our distance." Even so, it took all his self-control not to run headlong toward the chaos, a father's protective instinct roaring within him. At last, the bikers split up. Some jumped on their motorcycles to pursue the fleeing truck, while a few others stayed behind to guard the van of contraband. Samuel, Ben, and Jorge used the opportunity to retreat further into the forest, looping around to where they'd parked an old Jeep. Once they reached it, Samuel tried calling Hannah's phone, but it went to voicemail. Anxiety gnawed at him like a starving rat. They drove back toward town, uncertain of what they would find. A mile outside Eagles Point, they encountered police sirens wailing in the opposite direction, no doubt responding to the fracas. Samuel flagged them down, breathless, quickly explaining there was a potential shootout. But his main question was, "Have you seen my daughter, Hannah Collins?" One officer shook his head, urging them to remain back. "The sheriff's in trouble out near Redwood Cove. We're responding. Please clear the road." Samuel clenched the steering wheel. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to do something, but the officer's face was stone. "You're unarmed civilians," the cop said. "Stay behind." Unarmed, sure, Ben muttered once the cruiser sped off, but Sam could take them on with bare hands if needed. It was meant as a half-joke, but the seriousness in his tone revealed how much they relied on Samuel now. By the time they reached the outskirts of Eagles Point, they caught wind of the chase ending at the gravel pit. A wave of relief washed over Samuel when he heard a second-hand report that the sheriff was safe and that a young woman had been driving the truck. But that relief was laced with dread. The rest of the Steel Vipers wouldn't let this lie. They parked at the harbor, where a tense crowd had gathered, buzzing with rumors of gunshots, wounded bikers, and Hannah's daring rescue of the sheriff. Some fishermen cheered when they heard the tale, but the cheers sounded hollow. Everyone knew the reprisal would be fierce. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Hannah appeared in a police cruiser. She'd been escorted back into town for questioning and safety. The moment she stepped out onto the dock, Samuel wrapped her in a tight embrace, burying his face in her hair. "Dad," she whispered, voice quivering. The lingering shock in her eyes nearly broke him. He pulled back, scanning her for injuries. Aside from minor cuts from shattered glass and a bruise on her temple, she seemed physically okay. Emotionally, though, her trembling hands told another story. "I'm proud of you," Samuel murmured, "but don't ever scare me like that again." The sheriff, sporting scraped elbows and a face streaked with dust, limped over. "Collins," he greeted. The set of his mouth suggested a mixture of gratitude and frustration. "Your daughter saved my life out there." Samuel nodded. "I know. She also risked hers." Mills sighed, looking suddenly older. "Two of the bikers are in custody, one in critical condition. The rest scattered, but we know exactly who they are. We have enough evidence now, thanks to the firearms they brought to Redwood Cove, to request state trooper backup." He paused, glancing at Hannah. "But that won't happen overnight." Ben stepped forward. "So what do we do until then?" Mills spread his hands in resignation. "We'll do what we can. Patrols will increase, and I've called in favors from the next county over. But the Steel Vipers are out for blood now. I advise everyone to stay indoors, lock your doors at night, and keep your phones at the ready." A bitter laugh escaped one of the fishermen in the crowd. "That's not enough. We need more than warnings. We need action." Samuel locked eyes with Mills. "I'll do whatever I have to do to protect this harbor." The sheriff's lips pressed into a grim line. He didn't protest, but a flicker of worry crossed his face. Perhaps he sensed the dangerous glint in Samuel's eyes, the look of a man prepared to step outside the law if it meant keeping loved ones safe. With that, the group dispersed. Hannah and Samuel made their way home, flanked by concerned neighbors. That night, they slept in shifts. Samuel patrolled the perimeter of their property with a flashlight and his 9mm at his side, adrenaline keeping him awake despite his exhaustion. Hannah dozed fitfully in a chair by the window, jolting awake at every distant engine sound. Morning arrived, cold and gray. Word traveled fast. The Steel Vipers had holed up in the cannery again, and Talon was enraged about his wounded men. Rumors swirled that he swore vengeance against the fisherman and his daughter. At noon, a local fisherman found a black envelope pinned to the dock's notice board with a knife. Inside was a crudely drawn depiction of a severed hand with the words, "This is just the start." The sheriff took it as evidence, but the message was clear. Hannah tried to keep herself composed, but the threat was too direct to ignore. She hovered near her father, who was busy tying up loose lines on their boat. His calm, methodical actions were in stark contrast to the turmoil around them. "Dad, we can't stay here," she pleaded, her voice hushed with urgency. "They know who we are. They're threatening us." Samuel didn't pause in his task. "Running won't solve it. They'll just terrorize the rest of this town." Tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. "I can't lose you. Not after losing Mom." The mention of her mother brought a painful lump to her throat. Her mother had died years ago from a sudden illness, leaving father and daughter to navigate life alone. A softness flickered in Samuel's eyes, but only for a moment. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere. I won't give them that satisfaction. And I won't let them hurt you or anyone else if I can stop it." She wiped at her eyes, a mix of resolve and dread swirling inside her. "Then what's the plan? Are we just waiting for them to show up?" He glanced around, aware of other fishermen within earshot. Lowering his voice, he said, "We have to take the fight to them, somehow. They're cornered now, and cornered animals are the most dangerous." Hannah nodded. A sense of grim acceptance settled over her. If confrontation was inevitable, she wanted to be ready. In the following hours, Eagles Point became a ghost town. Shops shut down, windows were boarded, and rumors spread that some families had packed up and left for safer areas until this all blew over. The tension was palpable, a war about to erupt in an unlikely place. Samuel's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, midnight. "Cannery. Be there or we burn the docks." He showed the text to Hannah, his face unmoving. "It's from Talon, no doubt," he said. "He's calling me out." Hannah's stomach twisted. "Dad, it's a trap." "Obviously," he answered calmly. "But if I don't show, the harbor pays the price. If I go, it might be a suicide mission. One man against an armed gang." She ran her hands through her hair, panic creeping in. "We'll go to the sheriff. We'll get backup. Samuel placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "We've got a handful of local men who can handle themselves. The sheriff will come if he can, but we can't count on it. The troopers won't arrive in time. This fight is happening tonight, with or without them." Her heart thundered. "Let me come with you." A fierce protectiveness flared in his gaze. "Absolutely not. You'll stay safe. If anything happens to me, you drive out of town and don't look back." Tears stung her eyes. "But, no buts," he said firmly, drawing her into a quick embrace. "I love you, Hannah. Trust me on this." Then, pulling back, he added quietly, "I have a plan." Those words offered little comfort, but she knew better than to argue further. She'd witnessed her father's capabilities in smaller doses. If he said he had a plan, it meant he intended to exploit every skill the Navy had taught him. A flicker of hope battled with her dread. As dusk fell, the fisherman's cottage turned into a staging ground. Ben and Jorge arrived grim-faced to finalize strategies with Samuel. Another ally, an ex-Marine named Quinn who ran a small repair shop, joined them. They spoke in low tones over a spread-out map of the cannery complex. Hannah hovered in the background, braiding and unbraiding her hair out of nervous habit, longing to be useful. Eventually, they all parted ways to prepare. Samuel walked with Hannah to her bedroom, where she kept a small revolver in a lockbox, left to her by an uncle who believed in self-reliance. Handing her the key, he said, "Only use this if you must. Aim center mass, squeeze the trigger. Don't hesitate." Her eyes widened. "Dad, I don't." He held her gaze. "I pray you won't have to. But the Vipers have no mercy. If they come here while I'm gone, you do what needs doing." Shaking, she nodded. Her father's stoic resolve both comforted and frightened her. This was no longer a small-town dispute. It was war, with lives in the balance. She fought the urge to beg him not to go. Deep down, she knew the time for pleas had passed. At around 11:30 p.m., Samuel stepped outside into the chill night air. He wore dark clothing and boots that laced high, his pistol holstered at his side. In the distance, the sea churned restlessly, the moonlight shimmering on the waves like ghostly apparitions. Hannah followed him onto the porch, her throat tight. "Please," she whispered, tears threatening. "Come back." He turned and placed a gentle hand on her cheek, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "I will," he said, though the heaviness in his eyes told her he wasn't certain. Then, with a last lingering look, Samuel descended the porch steps and vanished into the darkness. Hannah stood there, hugging herself, heart pounding in her ears. The quiet night seemed oppressive, each shadow a threat. In a few short hours, maybe less, a final reckoning would take place at the cannery. Somewhere inside that looming structure, Talon and the Steel Vipers awaited Samuel's arrival, guns at the ready, thirsting for revenge. And despite all her father's expertise, despite the handful of men who might stand alongside him, Hannah couldn't shake the fear that she might never again see the gentle fisherman who had raised her. All she could do was wait, alone in the dark, hoping against hope that his promise would hold true. Midnight settled over the abandoned cannery like a thick shroud. The building loomed against the moonlit sky, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust. Long ago, it had bustled with workers processing the sea's bounty. Now it housed a monstrous threat that had festered in Eagles Point. A single overhead light flickered by the entrance, casting a jaundiced glow on the cracked pavement. The Steel Vipers were waiting. Talon stood at the center of a wide-open loading bay, arms folded across his chest. Around him, gang members armed with shotguns, rifles, and handguns formed a loose semicircle. Their tension was palpable, each man scanning the darkness, anticipating the arrival of the fisherman who had caused them so much trouble. Talon rolled his neck, adrenaline pumping. His voice cut through the stale air. "He'll come. He cares too much about this pathetic town to let it burn." In the shadows behind a stack of crates, Samuel Collins crouched in silence. He'd arrived earlier than expected, slipping in through a side door with the stealth he'd honed as a Navy SEAL. The rest of his small team, Ben, Jorge, and Quinn, had taken positions around the perimeter, each with a specific job to do. They communicated via small two-way radios set on low volume, every whisper of static sounding thunderous to Samuel's heightened senses. His plan was straightforward but risky: sow confusion with a series of well-timed diversions, pick off key targets, and force a standoff. If the sheriff's men or state troopers were anywhere close to mobilizing, Samuel wanted to buy time for them to arrive. If they didn't, he'd rely on the element of surprise and the fact that the Steel Vipers expected a head-on confrontation, not a precision strike from multiple angles. Through the gloom, Samuel counted the bikers. 10? No, 12. Possibly more outside. He recognized some from Redwood Cove and the vandalism spree at the docks. Talon's presence was unmistakable: tall, muscular, a patchy beard framing a cruel mouth. The memory of him threatening Hannah seared in Samuel's mind, fueling a cold, disciplined fury. At precisely 12:07 a.m., the first diversion kicked off. Jorge, positioned near the loading bay circuit breakers, yanked down a lever. Instantly, the few working lights around the cannery blinked out, plunging the area into darkness. "Hey," one of the bikers shouted. "What happened to the lights?" A wave of confusion rippled through them. Talon snapped orders for someone to get the power back on, but before anyone could move, Quinn lobbed a flashbang grenade into the center of the group. A sudden deafening blast erupted with a blinding flash. The bikers yelled in alarm, some firing shots blindly. The muzzle flashes cracked like lightning in the pitch black. In that split second of disarray, Samuel sprang into action. He glided from cover to cover, using the darkness and the lingering effects of the flashbang to his advantage. He fired 2 quick shots, disabling a biker's rifle arm and sending another man sprawling with a bullet to the thigh. Chaos reigned. Talon roared for his men to spread out, to find the intruder. Another flashbang, tossed by Quinn from the opposite side, detonated. More gunshots, more confusion. Some bikers retreated deeper into the cannery, searching for vantage points. Others panicked, firing sporadically at shadows. Samuel pressed against a metal column, heart hammering in his chest. This was the kind of operation he conducted in covert missions overseas, small units exploiting darkness and surprise. But here, he had no official backup, no extraction team. Just the knowledge that if he failed, Hannah and the entire town would suffer. He radioed in a hushed tone, "Ben, hold your position. Quinn, keep them disoriented. Jorge, watch for anyone flanking us." Ben's voice crackled back softly, "Copy." Moments later, the overhead lights flickered back on, a partial restoration. Samuel squinted, his night-adapted eyes protesting the sudden brightness. He ducked behind a forklift, bullets ricocheting off the metal frame. A loud thud behind him made him spin. A burly biker lunged with a machete, eyes wild. Samuel dove to the side, rolling across the concrete. He kicked out, connecting with a man's knee. The biker howled, stumbling. Samuel rose, disarming him with a swift strike to the wrist, then delivered a precision blow to the temple that sent him crashing to the ground. Breathing hard, Samuel retrieved the fallen machete and tossed it aside. The clang reverberated through the cavernous space. He clenched his pistol, scanning for threats. Another gang member leveled a shotgun from behind a crate. Samuel dropped low, firing twice. The shotgun barked a single round into the ceiling before the biker slumped. Talon, partially shielded by a steel beam, caught a glimpse of Samuel's silhouette. "It's him," the gang leader bellowed. "Light him up." He unleashed a barrage from his own handgun, forcing Samuel to duck behind a pile of wooden pallets. Outside, the roar of motorcycles indicated reinforcements were arriving. The plan was unraveling faster than expected. If more Steel Vipers poured in, Samuel and his team would be outnumbered. He gritted his teeth, his mind racing for a new angle. Ben's voice came over the radio. "We've got more incoming. They're blocking the exits." Samuel inhaled deeply. "Stick to the plan. We hold him off until we can slip out. A high-pitched ping erupted near his head, Talon's bullets splintering the pallets. Samuel returned fire, his shots forcing Talon to duck. The acrid smell of gunpowder mingled with old fish and rust, an oppressive stench that burned his lungs. At that moment, Quinn's voice rang out, reloading. "Cover me." Two bikers had pinned Quinn behind an overturned forklift. Jorge tried to move to support him, but a volley of bullets forced him back. Samuel recognized the danger. Quinn was exposed, and if the bikers closed in, they'd cut him down. Summoning his courage, Samuel broke cover, sprinting across the open floor to draw the attacker's attention. Talon spotted him and shouted, "Now, take him." Three bikers pivoted, unleashing a hail of bullets. Sparks flew as rounds struck the concrete. Samuel zigzagged, feeling the heat of passing bullets. A searing pain lanced his left arm, but he kept moving, ignoring the shock. If he stopped, he was dead. He raised his pistol, took a breath, and fired at one biker's center mass. The man went down, coughing blood. Another turned to flee, but Samuel's second shot caught him in the leg, and he collapsed, shrieking. The third ducked behind machinery, returning sporadic fire. Quinn used the diversion to load a fresh magazine. He popped up, squeezing off rounds that sent the remaining adversary diving for cover. Jorge moved to secure the fallen bikers' weapons, disarming them to prevent further aggression. Blood trickled down Samuel's arm, soaking into his shirt. He tested his grip. It still held. Adrenaline pulsed through his veins, numbing the worst of the pain, but he knew it couldn't last. Talon seized the moment. He darted out from behind a steel beam, leveling his handgun at Samuel's exposed back. Quinn, reloading, couldn't react in time. Hannah's father was vulnerable, mid-step, lunging for a new piece of cover. A thunderous shot rang out, echoing through the cannery. Talon's aim faltered, and a bullet slammed into the floor near Samuel's feet, chipping concrete. Samuel spun, confused about who had fired. Through the swirling dust, he saw a figure at the side entrance, pistol raised. It was the sheriff, Mills, face grim, a streak of dried blood on his forehead. He must have gathered a small contingent of deputies and forced his way inside. The shot he'd fired had come within inches of Talon, forcing him to dodge. Now pinned between the new arrivals and Samuel's group, the steel vipers wavered. Some raised their weapons in defiance. Others glanced around, uncertain. Mills and two deputies advanced carefully, ordering the bikers to drop their guns. Talon sneered, refusing to yield. He lifted his pistol, ready to fire again. But before he could, Samuel tackled him in a full-body slam that sent both men crashing into a stack of crates. Talon lashed out with an elbow, catching Samuel in the jaw. Pain exploded in Samuel's head, but he clung on, grappling for control of the weapon. They rolled on the concrete, exchanging brutal blows. Talon was younger, stronger, but Samuel fought with a fierce resolve that only a father protecting his child and a man defending his town could muster. He twisted Talon's wrist, forcing the pistol away. It clattered across the floor. Talon, red-faced, broke free and threw a punch that caught Samuel in the ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Gasping, Samuel grabbed a broken pipe from the floor, swinging it in a tight arc that connected with Talon's shoulder. The gang leader roared in pain, staggering backward. Samuel lunged, driving his shoulder into Talon's midsection, tackling him to the ground. Dust and blood smeared the floor as they grappled. At last, Samuel pinned Talon's arm behind his back in a painful lock. The biker's face contorted, veins bulging in his neck. Mills and a deputy rushed over, guns drawn. "Don't move," the sheriff commanded, pressing a knee into Talon's back. Another deputy handcuffed the gang leader's wrists. Talon spat, eyes blazing with hate. "You'll pay for this," he snarled at Samuel, who was doubled over, panting heavily. "You think you've won? This is bigger than me." Samuel looked down at him, chest heaving, sweat mixing with blood. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Get out of my town." As if the words were a final punctuation, Mills yanked Talon to his feet, leading him away. Deputies and local men moved through the cannery, disarming the remaining bikers and checking for injuries. By now, at least a dozen law enforcement vehicles had pulled up, lights flashing in the darkness, their sirens echoing off the metal walls. The cavalry had arrived, albeit late. Ben and Jorge found Samuel slumped against a crate, pressing a rag to the bullet graze on his arm. Quinn joined them, sporting a bruise on his forehead. For a moment, none of them spoke, the gravity of what just transpired weighing on them. Then they exchanged looks of relief, battered but alive. The cannery was secure. The steel vipers inside were either arrested or incapacitated. A few might have escaped into the night, but their leader's capture was a crippling blow. Samuel exhaled, exhaustion sweeping over him. "Let's get you to a hospital," Jorge said gently, helping him to his feet. Samuel's thoughts drifted to Hannah. He yearned to see her face, to let her know it was over, for now at least. As he limped out of the cannery into the cool night air, paramedics swarmed to check the wounded. Blue and red lights strobed across the weathered walls, revealing the extent of carnage: bullet casings, broken crates, streaks of blood on concrete. At the edge of the scene, the sheriff caught up to him. Mills looked shaken, but gratitude shone in his eyes. "You did more than just protect your family tonight," he said quietly. "You saved this town." Samuel shook his head. "We all did. My daughter, my friends. We stood together." Mills nodded. "I'll see that it's recognized, and I'll make sure these men face justice." They watched as Talon, hands cuffed behind him, was led into a squad car, still spewing threats. But a door slammed on his curses, muffling them. For the first time in days, Samuel felt the knot in his chest loosen. The steel vipers had been neutralized, at least for now. Yet a lingering unease nagged at him. Talon had said, "This is bigger than me." Maybe the gang's network extended beyond Eagles Point, and maybe new threats would emerge. But for tonight, at least, the harbor was free from the stranglehold of these outlaws. Samuel closed his eyes, leaning against the ambulance that had arrived to treat his wound. In the back of his mind, a single image filled his thoughts: Hannah's relieved face when she realized her father had made it home alive. By the time Samuel stepped onto his front porch, dawn was just a murky gray on the horizon. An EMT had cleaned and bandaged his arm, urging him to visit the local clinic for follow-up. He'd shrugged off further medical attention, eager to see Hannah, to reassure her that he was okay. He gently pushed open the front door. The house was silent, shadows stretching long in the early morning light. Then he heard a rustle from the living room. Hannah stood, hands trembling, eyes wide with relief the moment she saw him. "Dad," she cried, rushing forward. She flung her arms around him, her entire body shaking in sobs. He held her close, ignoring the twinge of pain in his injured arm. "I'm all right, sweetheart," he murmured, stroking her hair. "It's over." She pulled back, tears streaming down her face. "Your arm, did they?" "Just a graze," he assured. "I've had worse from fishing hooks." It was a feeble joke, but it made her crack a watery smile. They moved to the couch, where he sank down, exhaustion evident in every movement. Hannah fetched a glass of water and pressed it into his hands. The gulp of cool liquid steadied his frayed nerves. She perched beside him, eyes still wet, studying his face for signs of deeper trauma. She noticed the dark smudges under his eyes, the bruises forming across his jaw and ribs. "You need rest," she said, voice thick with concern. He nodded, setting the glass aside. "I need to tell you what happened." She shook her head, placing a gentle hand on his. "No, you don't. I think I already know the gist of it." The sheriff called, said they arrested Talon and most of the gang. The rest fled. "We're safe now." He exhaled, leaning back against the cushions. At least for the moment. She swallowed hard, recalling Talon's threats. You believe they'll come back. A shadow crossed his features. Possibly. Talon implied the Steel Viper's answer to higher powers, other chapters, or bigger criminal syndicates. We can't be sure. She squeezed his hand in silent acknowledgement. For now, though, the immediate threat had passed. The father and daughter sat quietly, absorbing the enormity of what they'd been through. Neither of them had wanted this violence, but it had become unavoidable. The dawn's early rays began to push back the darkness outside, as if signaling a new chapter for Eagles Point. Eventually, Hannah stood and fetched some fresh bandages from the medicine cabinet. She carefully unwrapped the makeshift dressing on her father's arm, wincing at the sight of congealed blood. "You really do need stitches," she murmured, gently cleaning the wound. "I'll go later," he said, not wanting to leave her side just yet. He studied her movements, noticing a new steadiness in her hands despite the tears on her cheeks. A pang of guilt shot through him. He never wanted her to face such danger, but he also felt a quiet pride in how she'd risen to the occasion. Her voice trembled as she rebandaged him. "I was so scared. Every hour felt like a lifetime." He brushed a stray hair from her forehead. "I know," he said softly. "Me too." She blinked. "But you went anyway, even though you could have died." He regarded her with tired yet kind eyes. "When I joined the SEALs, I made a vow to protect this country, to protect innocent people. And when you were born, I made an even stronger vow to protect you. I couldn't let these bikers tear apart our home without a fight." She bit her lip, tears slipping down her cheeks again. "I didn't ask for you to become some vigilante hero." He pulled her into another hug. "I know, but sometimes life doesn't give us easy choices." They lingered like that, father and daughter, in the hush of a new day. Outside, the gulls began their morning cries, as if announcing the return of peace to Eagles Point. Later that morning, the town stirred with cautious hope. News spread that the Steel Vipers had been either apprehended or chased out. Police presence remained high, with a few state troopers finally arriving. Broken windows, spray-painted walls, and battered boats still bore mute testimony to the chaos. Yet in the crisp daylight, an undercurrent of relief coursed through the harbor. Shops reopened, fishermen returned to their routines, and neighbors ventured onto front porches to speak in hushed gratitude. Samuel eventually visited the clinic, where a nurse stitched up his arm. He endured the procedure with his usual stoicism, mind drifting to how Hannah was holding up. She insisted on staying by his side, refusing to let him drive himself. On the way out, they spotted Sheriff Mills in the waiting area, his arm in a sling from the Redwood Cove incident. He offered them a weary smile. "Collins, Hannah, glad you're both in one piece." Hannah smiled back, the tension in her shoulders easing. "Thanks to you." The sheriff shook his head. "I'm just sorry it took us so long to get there. But rest assured, Talon and his men will be facing a long list of charges. The DA is eager to make an example of them." He hesitated, his gaze shifting to Samuel. "I'll need statements from you all, every detail of what happened at the cannery." Samuel nodded. "We'll cooperate fully." Mills lowered his voice. "And if the investigation reveals any questionable tactics, I'll do what I can to protect you. You save lives, and sometimes that means doing things by the book or slightly outside it." Samuel's expression remained impassive. "I appreciate that, Sheriff." Hannah gave her father a sidelong glance, reading between the lines. The questionable tactics meant the flashbangs, the infiltration, and the lethal force used against multiple bikers. Legally, it might be a gray area, but morally, the entire town knew who the real villains were. They left the clinic and drove past the cannery, where yellow police tape cordoned off the building. A few officers milled about, collecting evidence. Hannah swallowed, recalling how it looked in the middle of the night, muzzle flashes lighting up rusted walls, her father diving for cover. She shivered at the memory. Back at the cottage, neighbors had dropped off small gifts, baskets of muffins, homemade soup, get-well cards with heartfelt messages. Hannah teared up reading them, realizing how close Eagle's Point had come to destruction. She helped her father settle onto the couch, hooking him up with blankets and pillows. "You really should rest," she admonished him. He couldn't hide a faint smirk. "All right, I will." As she turned to go, he caught her wrist gently. "Hannah," he said, voice low. She looked back, tilting her head in question. He studied her face, a mix of admiration and remorse coloring his gaze. "I'm sorry you had to go through all this. You're so young. You should be living your life, not worrying about criminals and violence." She knelt beside him, placing her hand over his. "Dad, I made my choice too. I drove that truck to save the sheriff. I don't regret it." A proud smile tugged at his lips. "You have your mother's courage, you know." Her eyes welled with tears. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, then nodded. "If she could see us now, she'd be fussing over both of us," he said gently. Hannah gave a soft laugh. She stayed with him until his breathing evened, and she realized he drifted off. In sleep, his features relaxed, losing the hardness that the past days had etched there. She brushed a piece of hair from his forehead, thinking of how many nights he'd stayed awake to protect her, how many sacrifices he'd made over the years. Despite the tragedies and terror they'd experienced, Hannah felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They had survived, father and daughter, forging an unbreakable bond that even the worst criminals couldn't shatter. Outside, the harbor glistened under the midday sun, the water calm and inviting. For the first time in weeks, the roar of motorcycles was absent, replaced by the gentle hum of boat engines and the distant laughter of tourists. Life in Eagles Point would carry on, battered but not broken. Little did they know, in a dusty cell on the edge of town, Talon sat in handcuffs, plotting his next move. The Steel Vipers might have been defeated here, but their network was vast, their appetite for vengeance deep. For now, though, the gentle hush of the sea enveloped the Collins family in a well-deserved respite. Hannah silently vowed to cherish every moment of peace they had earned, and to be ready should darkness ever again descend upon their shores. A week after the bloody showdown at the cannery, life in Eagles Point showed signs of returning to its old rhythms. Fishing boats departed at dawn, the diner bustled with locals and curious outsiders wanting to hear the tale of the fisherman who took down a biker gang, and the evening breeze carried more laughter than tension. Hannah busied herself helping her father with the day-to-day tasks around the dock. The damage to their boat had been repaired, mostly through the combined efforts of neighbors eager to repay the Collins family for their courage. Samuel, his arm in a sling, supervised with a grateful smile. In those quiet days, father and daughter fell into an easy companionship, each content in the other's presence. Sometimes they talked about the fight at the cannery, about fear, violence, and the scars it leaves behind. Other times, they simply enjoyed the harbor's salty serenity, letting the sea wash away darker memories. Word reached them that Talon was being transferred to a more secure facility pending trial. Several of his lieutenants faced serious charges, their bail set prohibitively high. Rumors floated around of a remaining handful of Steel Vipers scattered, but with law enforcement on alert, they posed less immediate threat. On a crisp morning, Hannah and Samuel stood at the water's edge. Fog drifted across the bay, and the gulls swooped low, searching for scraps. The gentle clank of a buoy echoed through the stillness. "Time to get back to normal," Samuel said quietly, pulling a net onto their boat with his good arm. Hannah nodded, inhaling the briny air. "I'm ready." Yet they both knew normal was forever altered. In adversity, they had discovered strengths within themselves and within each other that they never knew existed. They carried an unspoken awareness that, even in the quietest of places, danger could strike. But they also understood that together, they could face it. "What about the Navy side of you?" Hannah asked, her tone light but curious. He paused, looking out at the horizon. The sun was just peeking over the coastline, casting long rays on the water's surface. "It's always there," he admitted. "But I'd rather keep it buried. I never wanted you to see that part of my life. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from it. She reached out, squeezing his shoulder gently. You protected me in every way that mattered. I'm proud of you, of who you are. The corners of his mouth curved in a soft smile. I'm proud of you too, Hannah. They set out into the bay, the engine churning through the water. Each wave that rolled beneath the hull felt like a promise of renewal. The sun rose higher, illuminating Eagle's Point in gentle gold. Once, it had been just another small coastal town, barely noticed by the outside world. Now, it bore the scars of a battle fought and won. As Hannah stood beside her father at the helm, she felt a mixture of gratitude and wistfulness. She was grateful they'd survived, for the neighbors who'd rallied to their aid, for a sheriff who'd come through when it mattered most. But she also felt a twinge of sadness for the innocents they'd lost, for the knowledge that any peace could be shattered by forces beyond their control. Samuel guided the boat toward deeper waters, the wind catching Hannah's hair. She glanced at him, seeing not just the father she'd grown up with, but the unwavering protector who had risked everything to save her in their home. A quiet conviction bloomed in her heart. They would stand together, come what may. Below deck, stowed away in a locked chest, lay the tools of violence, reminders of a night that tested their resolve. For now, they remained hidden, and Hannah prayed they would never have to be used again. In that moment, father and daughter shared a look. No words were needed to convey the bond forged under fire, the unbreakable promise to guard each other, and the peaceful harbor they cherished. And so, they pressed forward into the open sea, their boat slicing through glimmering waters. Ahead stretched an uncharted horizon, unknown challenges, fresh hopes, and the beauty of a life defended against all odds. In the gentle hush of the morning tide, they found something more valuable than triumph, the steadfast certainty that together they could weather any storm.